Madrid, an early morning in the 19th century. The most powerful man in Spain steps out onto the palace balcony. Beside him, a young queen draped in white silk. But whispers trail behind them. Because everyone knows the horrifying truth, this woman will not live long. Before her, two young queens had already died mysteriously after wedding nights inside the palace. And soon a third, a fourth, would vanish as well. What you are about to hear is not just the tragedy of a diseased king, but proof of how absolute power can turn marriage into torture, love into an experiment, and human beings into living corpses. Before we descend into these forgotten pages of dark history, if you enjoy uncovering the buried truths of the past, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next haunting story. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. It amazes me that we are summoning these ghosts of history together across oceans and continents, connected by the same curiosity about the hidden past. Because what you're about to hear is not just a royal chronicle of Spain. This is the story of a man once hailed as El Deseado, the Desired One, who died as El Maldito, the Cursed One. And the legacy he left behind will haunt you long after this video ends. Madrid, 1834. The stone corridors of the Real Palacio lay silent. There was no music, no cheers, only the scent of incense and the stench of disease creeping through the cracks in the doors. Outside, the city was slowly dying from a cholera outbreak. Inside, the death of a single man had just echoed like a funeral bell for an entire royal dynasty. Ferdinand VII, King of Spain, had taken his final breath. His body rested on a silk-covered bed, stiff and still, with eyes barely shut, as if still watching those who had once mocked him. In the sealed chamber, the flickering candlelight danced across the white cloth draped over his waist, hiding what the servants whispered about in hushed voices, the royal curse. The only one still standing upright in the room was the young queen, Maria Cristina. She did not wail. She did not sob. She simply whispered through clenched emotion, "You must preserve it, so that the world remembers." She was speaking to the royal physician, who had just entered his hands, trembling as he clutched his medical tools. He had not been summoned to save the king. He was there for something stranger, to preserve the king's body and to preserve the very thing that had defined his entire life. The physician took a deep breath and pulled back the cloth. What lay beneath made his blood run cold. This was no longer the body of an ordinary man. It was a testament to decline, oversized, misshapen, like a biological symbol of power, twisted by generations of royal inbreeding. A grotesque form that had been whispered about for decades, but never dared spoken aloud. In that moment, the physician understood he was not just embalming a man, he was embalming a nightmare. But the tragedy had not begun here. It had started the moment Ferdinand was born. A child born of Bourbon and Habsburg blood, two royal lines intertwined over centuries, as if someone had written a deadly formula long ago. Marriages between uncles and nieces, between first cousins once praised for keeping the bloodline pure, had produced nothing but fragile monarchs, unstable minds, and a genetic map in ruins. Ferdinand was the final result. Even as a child in the palace of El Escorial, it was clear he was different. He was nothing like the princes in royal portraits, no strength, no charm. He was frail, with eyes that always seemed on edge, and soon the whispers began to spread through the halls. Doctors took discreet notes. Servants giggled behind his back. Foreign envoys wrote in their reports home, "The Prince of Spain bears a strange deformity. For a child, there is no cruelty greater than realizing your own body is the joke." Ferdinand learned that lesson early. Every look from a courtier, every polite smile from a guest felt like a dagger. He began to see mockery in everything, in the bows of his guards, in the laughter of the maids, even in blessings. The shame soaked in, hardening into a shell of hatred. To the world, Ferdinand was a deformed prince. But in his mind, one thought grew stronger every day: if I cannot be loved, I will be feared. And that obsession would follow him to his grave. Back in the room in Madrid, the physician began his work. He opened a vial of oil-soaked cloth strips and gently wiped down the cold, lifeless flesh. His hands trembled, but his mind filled with images: the screams of young queens locked in bridal chambers, custom-made pillows, sewn in secret, desperate prayers that were never heard. Each layer of fabric he wrapped around the body he knew was sealing not just flesh, but a dynasty haunted by the demons of its own blood. Outside the window, Madrid was drowned in mourning. The cholera epidemic had already killed thousands. But people whispered, the king's death is even more terrifying, because he has left the throne to a little girl, and the curse will continue. In the darkness of the room, the physician paused, looking one last time at Ferdinand's pale face. And he wondered, was this man truly a victim of genetics, or was he a monster born from his own bloodline? The narrator's voice echoes deep and cold like a winter wind. To understand who Ferdinand VII truly was, you must understand that he was not just a king. He was the final product of a cruel genetic experiment, a cursed card dealt from the moment of birth. His body became a prison for his soul and turned an entire kingdom into its prisoner. This is not the story of a dynasty. This is the story of a man whose deformity became the ghost that haunted a nation. The screen fades to black. A question flickers into the candlelight. If your body were a prison from the day you were born, could you rule a nation without turning them all into prisoners with you? El Escorial, 1784. Within the cold gray walls of the palace, the chapel bells rang out, announcing the birth of a prince. They called him Ferdinand, the new hope of Spain. But from the very first moment, destiny had already been written in invisible ink, the inbred bloodline of both the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. For 3 centuries, the Spanish royal family had locked itself into a dangerous game: marriages between cousins, between uncles and nieces, between aunts and nephews. They believed this would preserve a pure bloodline untainted by common ancestry. But the price was a long line of deformities, weakness, and mental illness. Ferdinand was not an exception. He was the final proof, the ultimate result of genetic decay. Even as an infant, servants whispered about the curse on the prince's body. Rumors crept through the corridors. Royal doctors took careful notes but kept them hidden. Foreign envoys visiting Madrid caught a glimpse of the child and wrote vague lines in their letters home. There is something not quite right. Ferdinand's childhood passed in a charade. He was dressed in lavish clothes painted into elegant portraits, but at banquets he could hear the stifled giggles, see the exchanged glances. He learned early that his body was not just a body, it was a joke. His father, Charles IV, was a weak king, more fond of hunting than governing. He had all but handed the court over to Prime Minister Manuel Godoy, widely rumored to be the Queen's lover. And his mother, Maria Luisa, was the true shadow of power in the palace, lustful, greedy, and unapologetically unfaithful. Ferdinand grew up watching his father humiliated daily, while his mother lay in the arms of another man. From childhood, he learned that power did not lie on the throne, it lay in humiliation and betrayal. The boy grew quiet. He would sit for hours in the corner of a room, staring out the window, imagining those around him, whispering, laughing at him. But that silence was not weakness. It was venom building inside. Shame turned into a slow, burning hatred. One day when he was about 12, A young page accidentally walked into his changing room and saw the prince naked. The next day, that boy vanished. His family was exiled from Madrid. And for the first time, Ferdinand tasted the strange sweetness of power the fear of others could hide his own shame. From that point on, whenever he heard laughter in the palace, Ferdinand no longer felt only humiliation. He felt a hunger to crush it. He began punishing servants for the smallest mistakes. He tested his power on those weaker than himself, as if only through this he could quiet the torment in his mind. As he entered his teenage years, royal doctors grew truly concerned. Secret reports were written and sent to the Vatican, describing the prince's abnormal structure. They used cold, clinical language, but beneath it lay a disturbing truth. Ferdinand's body was not like that of a normal human being. The notes were sealed and locked away in iron chests, but the rumors kept spreading. People began comparing the prince to a freakish creature, half man, half monster. Meanwhile, Ferdinand began walking the palace halls with watchful eyes. He believed everyone was laughing at him, and in those eyes something had shifted, a glint of cruelty, sharp and cold. It was not just his body that was deformed. His mind was being bent day by the weight of relentless shame. At one royal feast, while his parents and Godoy laughed loudly, Ferdinand sat quietly watching. A thought echoed in his young mind. One day I will crush all of you. One day every mocking glance will turn into a plea for mercy. That was not a passing thought. It became the foundation of Ferdinand's entire life power, used as a weapon to avenge humiliation. At 16 years old, Ferdinand was officially named the awaited heir. Conservative nobles praised him, calling him El Deseado, the desired one. They saw in him a symbol of hope against Godoy and Maria Luisa. But what they did not see, or chose not to see, was the deep obsession that had turned the young man into a walking shadow. Late at night in the palace, when everyone else slept, Ferdinand would often walk the halls alone. Servants later claimed they had once seen him standing in front of a mirror for hours, completely still, staring at his reflection. As if he were searching for another version of himself, another form, but could only see the same twisted image staring back, mocking him. That mirror in Ferdinand's room became the site of his private torment. And there he began to learn how to mask his disgust with a cold, rigid facade. He was no longer the boy who cried alone. He became a young man with eyes like steel and a tight-lipped smile that never revealed emotion. But inside, the hatred had taken root, waiting for the day it would erupt. That child, the product of poisoned blood, of mockery, of unspeakable secrets carved into flesh, would grow into a king the Spanish people would one day call the monster. But even as a teenager, Ferdinand had already made a choice. If the world saw him as a joke, he would turn the world into his own private suffering. The screen turns black. A voice rises low and chilling. Some children are born to be symbols of hope. Some are born to write the glory of a nation. But Ferdinand VII was born to be living proof of the collapse of a bloodline. And the shame he carried in his body planted the seed for a blood-soaked reign where not even those closest to him could survive the darkness he brought with him. Madrid, spring of 1802. The city was dressed in splendor. Church bells rang out, marking a royal wedding. Crowds gathered across the plazas, watching the grand procession roll by fireworks, white horses' cheers echoing through the streets. To the people, this was a sign of hope, a symbol that Prince Ferdinand el Deseado, the desired one, had come of age, and Spain's future would shine bright. The bride was Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, just 17 years old, young, beautiful, with eyes that held both fear and curiosity. She was the niece of Marie Antoinette, the queen who had died beneath the French guillotine. They called Maria Antonia, the Princess of Europe, a diplomatic gift in the form of a girl sent to Madrid to seal an alliance. The wedding unfolded like a flawless performance. The grand cathedral echoed with choirs, the couple knelt before the altar, and guests applauded with delight. But behind all the grandeur, the palace servants whispered to one another, "Tonight will not be like any other wedding night." Because everyone in the palace knew the body of Ferdinand held a terrible secret. That night, in a chamber draped in velvet, the moment the doors closed, Maria Antonia saw the truth that the court had kept hidden. She screamed, a shrill, shattering sound that echoed down the marble halls like glass breaking. The servants outside froze, but no one dared enter. That wedding night was not the beginning of love. It was the first nightmare of Ferdinand's married life. Maria Antonia, once a radiant princess, became a prisoner in a golden room where every night turned into a form of torture. Physicians were summoned in secret. They crafted special pillows to support the king's body, cold metal tools to assist in intercourse. They brought opium not to heal, but to sedate the queen, to turn the nightmare into a few hours of silence. Each night there was no sound of affection, only the scent of medicine, the clinking of steel, and quiet, stifled sobs. In letters sent to Naples, Maria Antonia wrote, "I am dying in silence. They call me queen, but I am only a doll torn apart in the hands of a monster." Those letters never left Madrid. But her despair echoed through the palace. Servants noticed candles burning until dawn and heard faint weeping from behind locked doors. Ferdinand, instead of recognizing his wife's suffering, sank deeper into his obsession. He believed Maria Antonia was mocking him too. Every time he saw the fear in her eyes, he heard the laughter of his childhood echoing in his mind. To punish her, he turned intimacy into a weapon, a way to fight back against the humiliation of his past. For him, each night of marriage was a battle against shame. When Maria Antonia fell ill, Ferdinand showed no concern. He believed she was faking it to avoid him. She coughed, trembled, grew pale. But to Ferdinand, it was nothing but a performance. Servants whispered that the queen had grown addicted to opium, using it to numb the terror her husband's presence brought each night. In May of 1806, Maria Antonia died at just 21 years old. Her death was officially ruled as tuberculosis. But across Madrid, the rumors spread she had not died from disease, but from a marriage that had destroyed her. At the funeral, Ferdinand stood beside her coffin, his face frozen. Witnesses said he leaned in and whispered something to her corpse. No one heard it clearly, but one servant claimed he said, "You betrayed me, but you will never leave me." The crowds outside mourned the young bride taken too soon, but within the palace, fear grew deeper. If this was only the beginning, how many more lives would be crushed under the shadow of Ferdinand? Maria Antonia became the first in a long line of women who entered the royal chamber full of hope, and left, if they ever left at all, with broken bodies and shattered souls. A voice rises cold as wind sweeping across a grave. Ferdinand's wedding night did not just destroy a bride. It marked the beginning of a reign where marriage became torture, where every queen was a failed experiment. Maria Antonia died young, but the question still lingers, did she die of illness? Or because love had been turned into a form of inescapable violence, the screen darkens. A question flickers haunting as a ghost. Is it possible that to love someone could be the fastest way to kill them? Madrid, 1816. The palace was lit once more. Another wedding. A second chance for Ferdinand VII, now king, to craft the image of a happy royal marriage before the eyes of Europe. The bride this time was Maria Isabel of Portugal, just 19 years old. She was youthful, full of life, her eyes shining with excitement as she walked into the cathedral, believing she was about to become the queen of a great kingdom. The crowds cheered and threw white roses across the streets of Madrid. To the public, the death of the former queen had been a tragic accident. To them, Maria Isabel was a new hope, a doorway to the future. But inside the palace, the servants whispered, "No bride enters the king's chamber and comes out whole." On the wedding night, as the doors closed, Maria Isabel was still smiling. But only moments later, a scream rang out through the halls. It was high-pitched, sharp enough to slice through the darkness. It made the guards tremble. It made the maids cling to one another. They knew it would not be the last scream. From that day forward, the palace turned into a golden prison, where every night was a ritual of torment. Maria Isabel, once an innocent princess, slowly became a shadow of herself. Servants later said she began avoiding mirrors. She could no longer bear to look at her own face, drained, tear-swollen, empty. At banquets, she sat in silence, untouched food before her, her hands trembling under the table. Every time Ferdinand touched her, she flinched, as if struck by lightning. Doctors were summoned once again. Sedatives were prescribed. Strange support devices reappeared in the Queen's chamber. But nothing could cure the terror of sharing a bed with Ferdinand. By day, Maria Isabel tried to play the role of queen. She smiled at ceremonies. She held her husband's arm before the court. But by night, she became a trapped bird beating her wings helplessly in a gilded cage. Her screams pierced the walls, echoed down the corridors, and disappeared into the shadows. Over time, the palace began to live in dread. Her cries became known as the music of Madrid's nights. Ferdinand felt no shame. To him, those screams were proof of control, proof that the humiliation of his childhood was being returned through the pain of someone else. He did not see Maria Isabel as a wife. He saw her as a mirror reflecting all the mockery he had endured. And he shattered that mirror night after night. Only 2 years later, the Queen's frail body could endure no more. Maria Isabel fell ill while pregnant. A fever took hold, and she died along with the unborn child. The funeral was shrouded in sorrow. The people mourned once again. They called her a flower that withered too soon. But within the palace, a chilling moment left everyone unnerved. Ferdinand stood motionless beside the coffin. He did not shed a single tear. He bent down and whispered something to the corpse, just as he had with Maria Antonia. One servant swore. He said, "You screamed too much. But from now on, I will hear you in my sleep." The Real Palacio became a place of heavy air. Servants whispered that at night screams could still be heard coming from the locked chamber. Those who passed by would avoid it, as if Maria Isabel's voice was still trapped within the stone walls. Maria Isabel left no children, no legacy. But she left behind a mark of horror. The palace was no longer a symbol of power. It had become a house of devoured screams. Ferdinand, instead of being wounded by yet another death, grew even colder. He began to believe that every woman who came to him was weak, unworthy, and disloyal. And in that chill, he prepared for a third marriage, as if each wife was merely an experiment, a tool to prove that he could defy what his body and fate had long mocked, producing an heir. But history once again would not stand with him. A voice speaks heavy and cold as metal striking marble. Maria Isabel died at just 21. But her death did not simply claim a young queen. It turned the Palace of Madrid into a spiritual prison, where the screams of women became more familiar than the prayers of priests. And Ferdinand, rather than stopping, saw it as a beginning. The question now is, how many more souls must scream before this dynasty falls into eternal silence? The screen fades. Beneath the flickering candlelight, a question appears. Is any palace grand enough to silence the screams in the night? Madrid, 1819. Only 3 years after the death of Maria Isabel, wedding bells rang once again. Another marriage, another queen, another chance, or more truthfully, another experiment. The bride this time was Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, just 16 years old. Her face still held traces of childhood, her eyes wide with innocence, unaware of what the palace she was about to enter truly was. To the royal courts of Europe, this was a necessary political alliance. To Ferdinand, it was his third attempt in the reproduction game, a duty demanded by the throne to leave behind an heir. The wedding took place with music, but without the splendor of past ceremonies. The people of Madrid whispered to one another as the carriages passed, remembering the two young queens who had died mysteriously after screams in the night. This wedding to the public felt more like a sentence already signed. In the honeymoon chamber, Maria Josefa trembled. She had never known a man, had never encountered the strange kind of fear now awaiting her. When the doors closed, what followed was not love nor even desire. It felt more like a medical procedure, cold and mechanical. Ferdinand was no longer a man seeking pleasure. He had become someone consumed by the duty to reproduce. He wanted a child, an heir, at any cost. And in that obsession, he turned his wife into a living corpse, a body forced through endless attempts, no matter the fear or pain. Servants recalled that each night in the queen's chamber held not just sobs, but prayers. Maria Josefa, a devout young girl, prayed through her agony, begging God for deliverance. Once she knelt for hours before a small altar in her room, clutching a crucifix and whispering, "Forgive me, for I am no longer human." The royal physicians were summoned again. They recorded notes, tested remedies, brought in supportive methods. But nothing worked. Year after year, Maria Josefa remained childless. And with each passing day, Ferdinand's gaze grew colder. To Ferdinand, this was no longer a marriage. It was a living laboratory. He no longer saw a woman in his wife, but a broken machine incapable of producing the result he demanded. His obsession with leaving behind an heir to prove his body was not fully cursed, turned into madness. And that madness crushed Maria Josefa. Servants said she became increasingly thin, her skin pale as paper. She lived in fear, curling up like a child trapped inside an adult's body. And then she began to disappear, no longer attending banquets, no longer stepping onto balconies. The palace swallowed her as if she had never been there at all. In 1829, after 10 years of marriage, Maria Josefa died at the age of 25. The official cause, tuberculosis. But to anyone who had lived in the palace, the truth was clearer. She had died as a failed experiment, a body worn down by hopelessness. Her funeral did not carry the mourning of the previous two queens. She passed away quietly, almost erased from memory. The people of Madrid mentioned her name only in sighs, another queen, another victim. But for Ferdinand, this failure did not stop him. It only pushed him deeper into despair. 3 wives, 3 graves, and still no heir. The throne trembled. All of Europe looked to Madrid and saw a tragic farce, a cursed king trying to produce life like a deranged scientist, but only spreading death. Servants said that after Maria Josefa's death, Ferdinand would stand for hours in the empty room, staring at the cold bed. He mumbled to himself, "No, I am not a failure. I will have an heir. I will." The phrase echoed again and again like an obsession, like a curse he had tied around his own soul. The real Palacio was no longer just a place of cries and screams. It had become a place of deadly silence. 3 young queens. 3 vanished voices. And only Ferdinand remained chained to his unfulfilled obsession. A voice rises heavy and haunting like slow knocks on a coffin. Maria Josefa Amalia died at just 25. They called it illness. But in truth, it was a failed experiment. Because in Ferdinand's hands, marriage was no longer love. It was a laboratory designed to prove he was not cursed. And with every failure, he proved the opposite, that he was the living curse, dragging to the grave anyone who dared lie beside him. The screen fades to black. In silence, a question appears. How many lives must be destroyed before a man stops trying to prove he is not cursed? Madrid, 1829. Ferdinand VII was now old, his body frail, diseased, and misshapen. But the throne still demanded one thing: a child. 3 queens had died young, leaving behind a palace filled with ghosts and curses. All of Europe looked toward Madrid with pity, a dynasty that could not produce a future. And then Ferdinand chose a new bride. His 4th and final wife, Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, just 23 years old. Young, beautiful, full of life, and most importantly, still young enough to bear children. To Ferdinand, she was not a wife. She was his last chance to break the curse. The wedding took place under a heavy cloud. There was no joy like in the years before. The people whispered, "3 queens are dead. Will this girl survive?" But Maria Cristina entered the palace with steel in her eyes. Unlike the brides before her, she was not naive. She knew she was walking into a survival game. On the wedding night, the doors closed, and inside that room, Maria Cristina faced the monster the palace whispered about. But instead of screaming, instead of trembling, she stayed silent. Her eyes wide open, watching, remembering. She knew to survive, she could not be a victim, she had to take control of the game. From that day forward, the palace became a battleground of reproduction. Maria Cristina was monitored, measured, and managed like a medical specimen. Doctors recorded every minor change in her body. Her food, her medicine, her sleep, everything was geared toward one goal: to make her pregnant. To Ferdinand, each touch was no longer desire. It was a desperate experiment. He clung to the thought, "I will have an heir. My bloodline will not end with me." When he looked at Maria Cristina, he did not see a wife. He saw an incubator where the fate of the throne was suspended. But Maria Cristina was different. Instead of breaking like the 3 queens before her, she adapted. She learned how to soothe. Ferdinand spoke sweetly, pretended to obey anything to avoid triggering violence. She turned fear into armor, and behind that armor was a will of steel. She would survive no matter the cost. In 1830, the impossible happened. Maria Cristina became pregnant. The entire palace erupted. Ferdinand wept. He believed the curse had finally been broken. When the child was born, a baby girl named Isabella, the church bells rang across Madrid. The people rejoiced, believing the future had returned. But for Ferdinand, joy was incomplete. He wanted a prince, not a princess. A baby girl meant the risk of the throne slipping into someone else's hands. In his eyes, the obsession remained alive. He decided there must be another child. There must be a male heir. In the years that followed, Maria Cristina became pregnant again. But fate was cruel. She only bore daughters. Ferdinand grew angry, desperate, while his body withered away. Illness consumed him until he could no longer walk, then could no longer rise from bed. But even as he lay dying, he whispered, "I must have an heir, a son." Maria Cristina, now hardened by the darkness of the palace, looked upon her dying husband with empty eyes. She had borne children. She had fulfilled her role as a vessel, and she understood Ferdinand would die, but the game would go on. Because Isabella, just 3 years old, would inherit the throne. And civil war was inevitable, as the conservatives refused to accept a queen. Ferdinand died in 1833 in a room thick with incense. Maria Cristina did not cry. She simply stood tall like a warrior finishing a battle and walked out of that death chamber. Ferdinand died with a curse unbroken, a lifetime spent chasing a male heir, only to leave behind a young daughter caught in the whirlwind of history. His death ignited the Carlist Wars, a bloody civil war that tore Spain apart for years. The throne he clung to with ruthless experiments became the excuse for blood to flow in the streets. A voice rises cold. As earth hitting a grave, Maria Cristina survived. But the price of survival was turning herself into a tool of reproduction in the hands of a cursed man. Ferdinand died without a son, and his tragedy became the tragedy of a nation, a country plunged into civil war because one man could not accept the truth about his own body. The screen fades to black. In the silence, a question appears, echoing like a church bell in the night. Is it possible that a person's true legacy is not the children they produce, but the wounds they leave behind for an entire nation? Madrid, autumn of 1833. Inside the Real Palacio, the air was thick with the stench of medicine and rotting sweat. Ferdinand VII lay on his grand bed, his body twisted and decaying like a wooden statue left to rot. His legs were swollen, blackened, numb. Every cough brought up blood and phlegm staining the sheets. Physicians surrounded him, swapping bottle after bottle, but all of them knew death was climbing up from his feet inch by inch. On his face, a flicker of arrogance remained. Even as his body rotted, he still barked orders, still demanded obedience. But between the fits of coughing, there were moments of panic. He whispered, "They are laughing. I can hear them laughing at me." The mockery of his childhood echoed in his mind, bouncing off the dark walls of the room. Maria Cristina stood at his side, her gaze cold. She was no longer the trembling young bride, she was a widow in waiting, poised for power. There was no love in her heart, only calculation. To her, Ferdinand was already a corpse. His death was not a tragedy, it was an opportunity. The night before he died, Ferdinand called Maria Cristina closer. He grabbed her hand with trembling purplish fingers. He whispered, "Protect my child. Do not let them steal the throne." His voice cracked like a frightened child pleading with his mother. In that moment, all the power of a king vanished, revealing a cursed man dying in fear, haunted by laughter no one else could hear. On the morning of September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII took his final breath. There was no scream, just a long sigh, then silence. The room went still, but his death did not bring peace. It opened a deeper wound. His coffin, draped in red velvet, was carried through the streets to the tolling of church bells. The people gathered, watching with conflicted eyes. There were no tears like those shed for wise kings. Only whispers, "El deseado," the desired one, has become "El maldito," the cursed one. But Ferdinand's ghost did not stop at the coffin. It lived on in what he left behind, a shaky throne, a little princess too young to rule, and a nation on the edge of explosion. The moment Ferdinand died, the power struggle began. Maria Cristina declared his daughter, Isabella II, only 3 years old, as the rightful queen. But the Carlist faction, backing Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos, refused. They would not accept a little girl on the throne. The result, the Carlist War, a bloody civil conflict that would last for decades, claiming tens of thousands of lives. Ferdinand, in his desperate obsession to produce a son, had failed, and that failure became a bloodstain across Spain. The throne he left behind was not secured by peaceful succession, but by war, bloodshed, and national fracture. In the memory of the people, Ferdinand was not remembered as a king. He was remembered as a nightmare. They whispered of wedding nights, turned into horror of 3 young queens who died in silence of screams echoing through palace halls. And they gave him a name, El Rey Monstruo, the Monster King. Historians later wrote that Ferdinand VII destroyed Spain by simply existing. But for those who had lived in the palace, memory was not academic. It was the chill in their spine when walking through the hallways at night, the faint echo of Maria Antonia's choking sobs, the piercing screams of Maria Isabel, the whispered prayers of Maria Josefa. The ghosts of three queens fused with the ghost of Ferdinand, drifting through every stone wall. Ferdinand died, but he did not disappear. He lived in every whisper about the cursed royal bloodline. He lived in every drop of blood spilled during the civil war he left behind. He lived in the hollow eyes of his daughter Isabella, a child thrown onto a throne like a puppet, to continue a play soaked in blood and tears. A voice rises low and haunting. Some kings die and leave behind monuments. Some kings die and leave behind glorious memories. But Ferdinand VII died and left behind a ghost. A ghost no one can see, but everyone can feel in the wind, whispering through the palace in footsteps at midnight, in the fear passed down from one generation to the next. A ghost that reminds us some rulers do not reign with power, but with a curse. The screen fades. A final question appears, etched like a blade into stone. If death is supposed to be release, why do some men die and still rule an entire nation? Madrid, after 1833. Ferdinand VII was dead, but his death brought no peace. Instead, it opened a blood-soaked void. The throne of Spain now belonged to Isabella II, a little girl barely 3 years old. The entire country suddenly became a chessboard, with factions crashing into one another to seize power. The conservatives loyal to Don Carlos Ferdinand's brother rejected the idea of a queen. They believed the throne could only belong to a man. Meanwhile, Maria Cristina Ferdinand's widow wiped away crocodile tears, stepped forward as regent, and declared she would protect the crown for her daughter. And so the Carlist War began, a brutal civil war, fought not only for the throne, but under the shadow of Ferdinand himself. Thousands died. Villages burned. The streets of Madrid filled with the bodies of soldiers. People whispered, "This is Ferdinand's true legacy, not children, but graves." In the memory of the people, Ferdinand did not leave the image of a king. He left behind a national wound. His name was passed down through chilling stories, royal wedding nights turned into torture, screams echoing through stone walls, 3 young queens dying in silence, doctors fumbling with vials and cold metal tools like surgeons in a nightmare. Those fragments wove together the picture of a haunted dynasty where the throne smelled of opium blood and decay. Ferdinand was once called El Deseado, the Desired One. But within a single generation, he became known as El Rey Monstruo, the Monster King. A name not given by scholars, but whispered by the people in fear. 19th century historians wrote that Ferdinand was a destroyer. He dismantled the Constitution, crushed liberty, and turned Spain into a stage for his personal obsession. But for those who lived inside the palace, memory was not political. It was the long nights where the wind carried the echo of a queen's sobs. It was the mirrors fogged by tears, where young brides looked into their reflection and no longer recognized themselves. And then came the haunting question: how many Ferdinands has history known? How many powerful men have turned personal shame into the scars of an entire nation? How many desired ones have become the cursed, leaving behind not glory, but darkness? Looking back, Ferdinand VII was not merely a man. He was a metaphor, a reminder that sometimes power does not heal wounds, it amplifies them. It takes a small pain and turns it into a national disaster. Maria Antonia, Maria Isabel, Maria Josefa. 3 names faded from history, but their stories remain as proof that women are often the first victims of diseased power. They are not remembered as queens, but as buried screams. And Maria Cristina, the only one who survived, did not survive through love. She survived by becoming cold, shedding her humanity to stay alive. Ferdinand's legacy is not Isabella II. It is not even the Carlist throne. His legacy is obsession. Obsession passed from one generation to the next in war, in books, in the lingering fear that a nation can be destroyed by a man who cannot face himself. 2 centuries have passed and people still tell stories of Ferdinand like ghost tales. Visitors to Madrid standing inside the Real Palacio have claimed they hear faint screams echoing from the walls. Some swear that when passing the royal bedchamber, they feel a chill down their spine, as if a pair of eyes is still watching. Ferdinand VII is dead, but death did not erase him. He lives in memory, in nightmares drenched in sweat. In the question that still has no answer, if absolute power can turn a mocked child into a king, can it also turn a king into a monster? And when the monster dies, what remains a dynasty? Or just a darkness that never ends? The screen fades to black. The pounding music stops, leaving only silence. One final line appears, etched into the void like a scar on stone. 200 years have passed. Ferdinand VII is no longer a man. He is a warning.